Hello, my little loves. So I'm back with another lesson. And what I thought we would do over the next few weeks is talk about and introduce you to a group of people known as the Fireside Poets. The Fireside Poets were very popular in the early 1800s, and I thought we would start off with my favorite fireside poet, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Wadsworth Longfellow. I know it's a really formal name, and for whatever reason, no one ever called him Henry Longfellow. They called him Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Longfellow was born in 1807. He was the son of some relatively wealthy parents. His dad was a well-known and powerful attorney. Longfellow was gifted almost immediately, very talented in writing and reading. He was good at math. He was really good at speaking. His father assumed that he would follow in his father's footsteps and become a lawyer. He attended Harvard and graduated there with honors, but he had some different ideas about his future. Harvard offered him a professorship, and eventually he became chair of the English department. It's really interesting when you read about Longfellow's past. When he was teaching at Harvard, he often taught several of the English courses himself and was often expected to write his own textbooks. Like, can you imagine having to write your own textbook? That's craziness. So I started with him because he is definitely my favorite of the 5 fireside poets. So let's talk really quickly about what is a fireside poet. Back in the 1800s, as you know, there weren't really televisions and Netflix and Hulu, and there weren't really even radios. And so families would get together by a fire and they would read. Now, oftentimes they would read the Bible. That was a pretty common thing to do. But more and more, Americans began to read poets. And so there were some favorites, and these favorites eventually became known as the fireside poets. And it was because their poetry, the American people believed, were easy to understand, their themes were relevant, and most people who read it were going through similar struggles or thinking in similar ways. And because of that, it gave families things to talk about. It was sort of like the after-school special, but in poetry, which I think is really cool. So I've chosen him because he is my favorite of the 5. But I also think that Longfellow has a message for you, and I'm hoping that you will understand what that message is. And so for the first poem that I wanted to read to you today, it's called the Psalm of Life. It's called the Psalm of Life. And of all of Longfellow's poems, this is my favorite. I love this poem. Mostly when I read it to students, they love this poem. So I'm going to ask a favor from you. As you watch this poem, I'm going to ask that you watch it with your eyes, that you listen to it, not watch it. You listen to it with your eyes closed so that you can see what Longfellow is trying to paint for you. And I'm just going to read it, and here we go. A Psalm of Life by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an empty dream, for the soul is dead that slumbers, and things are not what they seem. Life is real, life is earnest, and the grave is not its goal. Dust thou art, to dust returnest, was never spoken of the soul. Not enjoyment, and not sorrow, is our destined way, but to act that each tomorrow find us further than today. Art is long, and time is fleeting, and our hearts, though stout and brave, still like muffled drums are beating funeral marches to the grave. In the world's broad field of battle, and the bivouac of life, be not like dumb driven cattle, be a hero in the strife. Trust no future, howe'er pleasant, let the past dead bury its dead. Act in the living present, heart within, and God o'erhead. Lives of great men remind us, we can make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us footprints in the sands of time. Footprints that perhaps another, sailing o'er life's solemn main, a forlorn and shipwrecked brother, seeing, shall take heart again. Let us then be up and doing, with a heart for any fate, still achieving, still pursuing, learn to labor and to wait. So a couple of background infos on that little poem. Henry Longfellow married when he was in his early 30s, and very quickly after he married, he took his wife to Europe. And she died in childbirth. She had a miscarriage and she died. And a few years later, he wrote this poem and he dedicated it to her, because in his mind, even though she had passed away, he had to continue to live. And he had to continue to find the drive and the motivation and the inspiration to continue to be Longfellow, because he was one of the very few poets who was incredibly popular in his own time. And so he wrote this poem as a way to say, we need to be strong and we need to be meaningful. Our lives need to have meaning. And he was in his 30s when he wrote this. And so it's very positive and very inspirational. And every time I read it, I feel good. It's just a really good, wonderful poem. And again, I want to repeat to you, Longfellow was in his 30s when he wrote this poem. Now I'm going to read you his second most famous poem, which is called The Tide Rises and the Tide Falls. Longfellow wrote this very shortly before his own death. He died at about 75. And he knew, I think, he was very ill. And I think he knew that his time was coming. And so he wrote this poem as sort of a way to, I guess, tell everyone that he was okay with it. So again, I'm going to ask you to close your eyes and listen. And I want you to remember that this is now about 40 years later. So this is the same man, and this is him 40 years older, because he's talking about the same thing. The Psalm of Life is about life's journey and what we need to do in life's journey. Remember, his last line was to labor and to wait. So here is the tide rises and the tide falls. The tide rises, the tide falls. The twilight darkens, the curlew calls. Along the sea sands damp and brown, the traveler hastens toward the town. And the tide rises and the tide falls. Darkness settles on roofs and walls, but the sea in the darkness calls. The little waves with their soft white hands efface the footprints in the sands. And the tide rises and the tide falls. The morning breaks, the steeds their stalls, stamp and neigh as the howler calls. The day returns, but nevermore returns the traveler to the shore. And the tide rises and the tide falls. I want you to think about the tones of these two poems. Now, I know that I tell you to write all the time, and I say, listen, you need to write. You need to write every day. And you need to write every day because the person that you are today, you will not be that person tomorrow. And yes, the change will be minuscule. It's like how our earth goes from light to dark, right? Right now, we're moving towards June 21st, which is the summer solstice, and that's the longest day of the year. But it doesn't happen overnight. We don't gain 4 hours of daylight, like, it's 4 hours of daylight. No. We get a few seconds, and then maybe a minute, and maybe a couple of minutes, but it's a slow transition to that June 21st, just like it's a slow transition back to December 21st, which is the shortest day of the year. Your life is like that. You know, you're not going to notice the change, not right away, but it does happen. And Longfellow shows you that it does happen. If I hadn't told you that these two poems were written by the same people, do you think you would have known that? It's important for you to write, for you to record how you're feeling now, for you to record what this experience is like. And I know that when you read it in 10 years, you're going to think, oh my God, I can't believe I ever felt that way. But it's important that you feel that way. And it's important to remind yourself that you feel that way. And that's why I encourage you to write. Because one of my heroes, Longfellow, showed me how important it really was. Because both poems are beautiful. And both poems have beautiful meanings. And both poems are about life and death. But their outlooks are very different. And we'll talk about that in my next lesson. Thanks for watching.